In the previous clip you learned how to use a blob's e-tag to implement optimistic concurrency, which means that you check before an update if the blob was changed in the meantime. In this clip you will learn how to implement pessimistic concurrency, which means you create a lock on the blob so that other users and processes are not able to update the blob anymore. Blob storage supports a lock with a lease. Let me show you now in a demonstration how to use a lease to implement pessimistic concurrency. Let's switch to Visual Studio. The Coffee Video Admin application has here a Lease Actions button. When a user clicks on that button, they can acquire a lease, release a lease, and show information about the lease. But the logic for these actions is not implemented yet in the Coffee Video Storage class. So let's do this and let's close the application. As you can see, there are a bunch of to-do commands for us. Let's start here with the acquire 1-minute lease async method. The to-do command says you need to acquire a lease for the blob for 1 minute. So let's do this. Let's just call on the cloud blob the acquire lease async method. You can pass in a time span to define the lease time. The lease time can be between 15 seconds and 60 seconds. You can also pass in null and then you will create an infinite lease. But in our case, let's use a time span and let's just create a lease for 1 minute. The acquire lease async method returns a task of string. The string that is returned is the lease ID. That's an identifier. It's like a key that allows you to execute actions on the locked blob. Before we implement the other methods here, let's right-click on this acquire 1-minute lease async method and let's find all the references. As you can see, this method is called from the Coffee Video View model. So let's go to the Coffee Video View model. Here we are in the acquire lease async method of the Coffee Video View model. And here you can see the call of the acquire 1-minute lease async method of the Coffee Video Storage instance. The returned lease ID is stored in a lease ID property of the Coffee Video View model that is of type string. Then a lease renew timer is started and the user sees a dialog lease acquired. Let's take a look at this lease renew timer. It is initialized in the Coffee Video View model constructor. So let's scroll up to the constructor. Here you can see how a new dispatcher timer is created with an interval of 45 seconds. This means that this timer always ticks before the lease of 1 minute expires. In the tick event handler of the timer, the renew lease async method of the Coffee Video Storage instance is called. Beside the cloud blob, the lease ID is passed to that method that we got from acquiring the lease. Now let's implement the renew lease async method in the Coffee Video Storage class. So here I just call on the cloud blob the renew lease async method. And you can see it takes an access condition. So let's just create here a new access condition. And let's set the lease ID property of that access condition to the lease ID we get in this renew lease async method. And now I just pass the access condition to the renew lease async method of the cloud blob. Now I just copy this block and I go to the release lease async method. When a user clicks on release lease in the user interface, the Coffee Video View model stops the lease renew timer. It calls the release lease async method of the Coffee Video Storage instance and it sets its lease ID property to null. So let's just paste the block and instead of calling renew lease async, I call here release lease async. And of course, I used the same access condition with the lease ID. The last to-do command we have here is to load the lease date, status and duration for the blob and return the string below with that information. So let's do this. Let's get rid of this to-do command. The lease date can be found in the properties of the cloud blob. Here is a lease state. So let me just copy this and let's go to the lease status. The properties contain also a lease status and let's paste it again. And of course, the properties contain also a lease duration. If you want to get the latest values of these properties from blob storage, you just call on the cloud blob the fetch attributes async method. Now let's run the application and let's see the lease implementation in action. Let's go to the taskbar and let's fire up another instance of the Wired Brain Coffee Video Admin application. I select the skateboarder MP4 file in both applications. In the left application, I click on lease actions and I show the lease information. You can see the lease state is available, lease status is unlocked, and lease duration is unspecified. Now let's click on Acquire Lease. Lease acquired, and you can see the lease ID, which is just an identifier. Now let's click again on Show Lease Information. The lease state is now leased, the status of the blob is locked, and the duration is fixed, as we have created a lease for 1 minute. But as you know, as long as the user doesn't release the lease, it is always renewed by the dispatcher timer of the coffee video view model. Now let's go to the right application and let's try to change something. Let's write here just instead of coffee on the board, coffee skater. And I click on Update Metadata. You can see an error, there is currently a lease on the blob and no lease ID was specified in the request. This is now true for everything that tries to update the blob. So even when I try, for example, to delete this blob. Let's click here OK, and you can see we get the same error, there is currently a lease on the blob. Now let's close this, and let's go to the application on the left, and let's release the lease. The lease was released, great, and now in the application on the right, I click on Update Metadata. Now it worked immediately, and I can reload it in the application on the left. Great, but now we have still one problem. When the application on the left acquires a lease, this application also can't change the blob anymore. So let's write here, for example, the original title, Coffee on the Board. And let's click on Update Metadata. This instance with the lease ID also gets the error that there is currently a lease on the blob and no lease ID was specified in the request. This means when you update the metadata or when you override the blob, you need to specify the lease ID if you have it. Let me show you how to do this in the next clip.